Three.
Hey, my name's Jim, and I'm a second semester graduate student at John Jay for International Crime and Justice. I think it's about time we talked about coffee. Many people say it's addictive, but what do they really mean by that? Let's think about it for a moment. Is coffee dangerous to you? Dangerously delicious? Well, that's because everyone likes coffee, and even if you don't, that's a preference. Let's go into further details.
So what do you think about coffee?
Well, to me, coffee is a good way to start the day. It brightens up your mood. It's something to look forward to the moment you wake up. You wake up, you're a little groggy, there's that instant boost from a drink that's so delicious and nutritious if you make it right.
How important do you think how important do you think the coffee product is to you?
To me, it's pretty well integrated. Heck, most of my days in college, I used a coffee product to wake me up. I don't think I could have made it for a lot of those 8 a.m. classes without it. But I don't really think we take the time to evaluate coffee, let alone the people who actually make it. Is it the companies? Let's go further into it.
Does coffee have a cultural aspect to you?
I would say it does. My mom drinks it, I drink it, heck, even my father drinks it to some extent. We all make it different, and that's what makes it unique. But as I mentioned earlier, it's necessarily the way that we make it that brings out the best of the product that we don't really appreciate. Like, it's not necessarily that the coffee that we buy from the store that's really getting our, how should I say, attention. It's the respect we need to give to the people who really make the product. Not the corporations, not the companies, but the actual growers who tend to be from Latin America.
Why do you think coffee undervalues its workers?
Well, believe it or not, coffee is an international commodity that's commonly traded in imports and exports. As I mentioned, it's heavily integrated into a lot of cultures. True, there's a lot of people who don't like coffee, but there's also a lot of people who do. Expanding on what I said earlier, it tends to be grown in Latin America because it needs to be grown in a very shady but wetland-like environment. So you'll see it mainly in places like Brazil, which tends to supply 35% of the world's supply. Maybe places nearby like Peru. But again, you really need a very specific wet environment that you tend not to find in the United States. You could make an exception, but it's not going to be the same amount or the same quality. That's what makes coffee unique.
How do you think we can improve coffee production for the actual grower?
So coffee production is limited to 3 types of beans that mainly tend to be import and export. I'm sure there's multiple types, but the 3 main types are the Arabica, the Robusta, and the Libeca, though the Libeca tends to be made for green coffee, so we don't really use that as much. The Robusta and the Arabica tended to be farmed, like as I mentioned, in Latin America, with their importance being shifted to sun cultivation. Sun cultivation is when you use a really shady environment heated from constant heat of the sun to force the product to grow specifically that you want. For example, let's say I'm growing a coffee bush and it's next to some banana trees. The sun cultivation is going to make more of the liquid go down into the soil, which is more heavily rooted with the coffee bush than the actual banana tree. It's pretty much using other crops as a means of protection for the actual coffee product. But in doing so, it limits the amount of plants that can be grown in the area to specifically coffee, though it's not limited to coffee. You could use it for any plant, really. Apologies.
What do you propose we do about it?
Well, this is the tricky part. So, coffee production, it heavily is distributed throughout the world, but it's not heavily respected throughout the world. We assume that it's a company-made product, but we don't give the same amount of appreciation to the workers who make it. For example, most workers on, let's say, a $3 cup of coffee will barely make 5% of that. It really doesn't reflect the quality of their drink that so many people appreciate. And since it's heavily integrated in the world market, this is actually a very tricky situation, which tends to be heavily leaned on by fair trade practices, which many people like to assume is equal distribution because of its name, but even that can be questionable in some circumstances. We need to necessarily look at legislation specifically for each nation, and I know that's extremely tricky, but that's the best way because it's not necessarily exported the same way to one nation. One nation's economy might be bigger or take in more quantities of it. It might distribute more, And in turn, it might not pay the same amount of price. So we need to look at what's equal price and preference per nation, but that's necessarily fair to the worker, which is a little bit of a tricky situation. This requires further evaluation, which I think we can work on.
So how do you propose we fix the coffee market?
An interesting question. So let's further expand on that international concept I mentioned. Like I mentioned, coffee is distributed internationally as a cultural product heavily throughout many nations. While it's integrated in many nations, not everyone drinks it to the same extent, but it does have association to multiple nations. In particular, to make sure that actual growers receive respect for their product, we need to make sure that the legislation is more in favor to them. So let's talk about that. I propose that we do something along the lines of a Green New Deal. We're going deeper into coffeenomics. We need to make sure that the actual money flow, I'll say, gets back to the actual producers. In particular, this is tricky because once the coffee is exported, let's say from Brazil to the United States as a product, you're obviously not going to see the financial backflow go back to the grower. So I propose that we look into legislation that can particularly reference the importance of the grower in the actual price that's being bought. So what does that mean? So let's say that we buy, I'll keep it simple, 5 bags of 10 pounds of coffee Arabica beans, and it costs $20 a piece for 100. Okay, how much is the coffee grower gonna get? An estimated less than $5, literally. So 5% if you want to think about it like that. We need legislation that actually gives a percentage of the actual deal before the transaction's completed. So let's say reasonable, no world economy is the same, obviously. Like 8-10% of the actual transaction is funded back to the grower to help in their needs. This is mostly for their lifestyle, as coffee is a product that you really have to dedicate your life to. Sun cultivation is not an easy practice. Also, coffee, let's think about it. If the grower is actually making $5 out of 100, that's pretty low. I propose we look at legislation where if the economic surplus of profit is heavily not in favor of the grower, as example, as I just mentioned, for the $100 of which they get 5, they get a little bit of that transaction back at them. Let's say 25% to show respect for the commodity, because obviously if you're making let's say over 1,000% profit, it deserves to go back to the grower. My good friend Jason, a recent graduate of John Jay College of Criminal Justice and of psychology. Let's see what he thinks of coffeenomics. So tell me, Jason, what do you think of coffee?
I think coffee is a wonderful thing. I think it brings people together, has different flavors so people can enjoy the different aspects of it. I really find the history of coffee interesting because it wasn't native to Europe, and actually coffee was grown in the Caribbean first. So we really didn't know about the aspects until like centuries earlier. So coffee really has an interesting story to us. And I think what coffee does is, besides gives us energy, it allows us to like enjoy in the small things when we talk to like people that we like.
So you value it very much. That's good.
Yeah, somewhat. My grandma used to give me coffee when I was little as a kid for breakfast. She used to serve it with like a little bit of bread, a little bit of sugar and everything. But personally, I'm not the biggest coffee fan, but I do enjoy a nice cup of coffee. But if anything, home brew, nothing too expensive, nothing Starbucks, decent coffee.
Tell me, do you think that the coffee product values its workers properly?
I think coffee has to do more to value its workers because we hear stories about the workers getting underpaid or used as wage slaves. So we really had to come to the conclusion that, we need to pay these workers more so they won't get exploited. For example, when coffee is grown in other countries, labor is basically cheaper there, so they can give people less money than they do over here.
Very good point.
So what they basically do, export the labor abroad, pay people less so they can maximize the company's profits, while we enjoy the fruits of the labor in the United States, while the people over there are barely making ends meet to support their family.
I see. So tell me, how do you think we can improve the production of the actual grower?
I think we have to give the workers better working conditions.
Oh.
And make them assured of their rights, because a lot of the workers don't know they have rights, and if they don't know they have rights, they're going to be abused by their employers. So we basically have to make the workers, more knowingly of their condition. So basically, if they're on a coffee farm where they're farming these coffee beans, and they're being exploited by working like many hours a day and being paid like really less, we have to bring to the attention of these coffee companies that the workers are actually the reason why they're making so much profit.
So would you say like a better form of fair trade?
Better form of fair trade, yes, for the worker and the employer. Basically, the workers and employers have to come to an agreement on what is fair pay. Because sometimes people do these jobs out of necessity to provide for their family.
Wow, lifestyle choice.
Not because they want to do it. So in order to have this like fair trade deal, we have to, as I said before, we have to say to the workers that they have rights and they deserve to get paid fair and square and work in safe working conditions.
I see. Thank you for your perspective. This has been Jason with Coffee Knowledge.